All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Scientists to Go. Today, we're joined by Dr. Chris Law. He studied environmental systems in college and went on to get a PhD in ecology at UC Santa Cruz. He's currently doing a postdoc working with the University of Texas, University of Washington, and the Natural History Museum, which is actually my favorite museum ever. So that's pretty cool. He also supports first-generation college students to enter the STEM field. But quickly before I turn it over, I just want to remind you that you can put any questions you have in the chat and we'll get to them at the Q&A section at the end. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Awesome. Let me just set this up. Okay, everybody see that? Great. Well, thanks for the invite. I'm excited to chat about a little bit of my research and like how I guess I became a scientist. So I see myself as like an evolutionary biologist that's really interested in just the tree of life. So like here's a figure that you may have seen. It's just looking at the evolutionary relationships between different types of animals ranging from, or even, plants and animals ranging from things like worms to dinosaurs to birds to mammals and all sorts of things. Primary group that I work with now are up here, the mammals, just because I think they're the coolest. So before I talk about my research, I guess I'll just introduce myself in terms of like how I actually became a scientist. So right now, I'm a research scientist at the University of Washington, all the way in Seattle, Washington. So like we're over right here, basically on the other side of the country from where you guys are. And one of the buildings that I work in is the Burke Museum of Natural History, which is pictured here. And it's a pretty sweet spot just because there's a lot of cool specimens to work with, but then we also get lots of visitors, including schools that visits during the days, and they get to see all the exhibits and look at the behind the scenes and whatnot. So it's a pretty fun place to work. So before that, before I became a scientist, I really grew up watching these kind of shows, like Planet Earth, Wild Discovery on the Discovery Channel, and even the cartoons like the Wild Thornberrys. And these things really kind of inspired me to want to pursue biology in terms of like more zoology, like understanding like why there's so many animals and what do they do in the wild. But the greatest show or movie that really inspired me to pursue biology was Free Willy. And I don't know if some of you guys have actually seen this movie, but if you have not, it is the best movie ever, just because who doesn't want to be the kid that, saves orcas or rides orcas back into the wild? So that really pursued me or wanted me to pursue biology. Um, um, as I go to school and I kind of grew up and stuff like that. So that inspired me to go to San Diego for my undergraduate degree. And UC San Diego is along the Pacific coast, obviously, in San Diego, and it has a great marine biology program. So like this is the Scripps Pier, which is off campus. And then this is the main library, and people think it's a spaceship looking thing. So I thought it was pretty cool. But yeah, UC San Diego is where I did my undergrad and got into more biology, particular marine biology. And like I said, because it's along the coast, there's all these awesome habitats, uh, such as the intertidal zone, where you get all sorts of marine invertebrates. And then if you get on a boat, you can see some whales. So like during my time there, I volunteered at the Birch Aquarium, which is part of the campus. So I helped interpret what tide pools were, and then even went whale watching and be like an interpreter for visitors to describe what they're seeing. So that was pretty fun. But along with my journey in San Diego, I took a little break and studied abroad in Australia, and that's where I saw even cooler things like sea turtles, a bunch of marine invertebrates, obviously coral, and took my first selfie with the kangaroo, which was pretty sweet. So it was pretty fun just to be out there in these different environments, ranging from rainforest to the coral reefs to the outback and lots of all these ecosystems. And this was kind of my first experiences gaining in terms of doing research. So like this program I did was a field-based course where basically they just take you out to these different places, and the main part of the course is just basically work in a group, come up with a research question, collect data to answer your research question, and kind of interpret your results. So this was my first experience, and I loved it. And that's when I learned that, oh wait, you can actually do this for a job, you know, as a career in terms of researching what animals are doing out in the wild or in lab or whatever. So when I got back to San Diego, I wanted to pursue some kind of research or gain research experience. So one of the labs that I was uh, lucky enough to work with was this polychaete lab in San Diego. So polychaetes, if you don't know, are marine worms that are related to earthworms. So if you've seen an earthworm, a lot of those polychaetes look very similar, but then there's also a lot of them have these weird shapes and sizes and like a lot of different features that you don't see in earthworms. So it was really cool to see a lot of these things up close, particularly in like under microscopes. And just looking at the diversity, it's really cool just to see the full view or a lot of these different species. And one of the goal of this lab was to basically understand why is there great diversity in these different worms? Why do they look so different? And how do those differences lead them to, differences in their evolution or behavior? So for my undergraduate project, one of the things I did was build a phylogenetic tree of polychaete worms. So a phylogenetic tree again, it's just it just connects the different species and how they're related to one another. So the group I worked with was called Opheliidae, and they're broken into two main groups, which was Ophelinae and Ophelinae. I don't know who comes up with these names, but we really were interested in understanding like how are they different. And the main differences we found was that they buried or dug through sand very differently. So one of the groups did this peristaltic burrowing, which is similar to how a caterpillar might be moving, where it's kind of like an inchworm movement, whereas the other one did more of this undulatory moving, similar to like how a snake might move. So what was fun about this project was that I got to use gelatin, which is this substrate, so that we can see them and basically stick worms in them and make a move, so then we can get some, do some kinematic analyses on them. So we took high-speed video of these different worms and then used a bunch of math to understand how these differences in movements led to differences in kinematics. One other thing we did was then also basically did dissections on these worms just to look at their inner musculature to see how they differ in their muscles and how those differences in muscles relate to their differences in movement. So all of this got me excited about research and wanted to go to grad school so I can do more of this research. But before I did that, I after graduating, before going to grad school, I decided to take a year off to work in a biotech company just to get that experience. And also I was poor, so needed some money. So worked at a biotech company for a year, realized that this was the most terrible thing I've ever done. So then applied to grad school, and I got into grad school at UC Santa Cruz, which is just up the coast from San Diego, just south of San Francisco. So that's during this time when I kind of transitioned to mammals. So I told my PhD advisor that at the time that I didn't really care what like group of organisms I worked with. I was just interested in making phylogenetic trees and mapping character traits onto them. And we were chatting, and she was suggesting, why don't you work on sea otters? Just because we're off the coast of Monterey Bay, and there's a bunch of sea otters there. So then I was saying like, oh, why not? So then that's how I got into, working with sea otters, because who cannot not want to work with sea otters because they are quite adorable. So sea otters, as many of you may know, that they live in the ocean, Pacific, primarily along the California coastline, in the 48 states. And as a species, they eat a variety of hard shell invertebrate prey. So snails, clams, mussels, crabs, abalone, urchins. So essentially your favorite types of seafood. And they exhibit all sorts of adaptations that allow them to, survive on these hard shell prey items. And we call this durophagy, which is of the ability for different animals to eat on these hard items. So these can be hard invertebrates, they can be bones, they can be seeds. And so basically anything hard, we can describe those animals as being durophagous. So they exhibit all these adaptations that allow them to eat these hard items, including these short, blunt skulls, tall mandibles, and these teeth that look very similar to ours, where they're nice, big, and flat and robust. So they get these more lariform dentition. So if you look at the back of your molars, we have very similar teeth structure as sea otters. One difference is that the sea otters enamel are fracture resistant, so they're much, much more thicker, or they're much thicker than our teeth. So definitely don't try biting on a shell of a crab or things like that, because you will probably fracture your tooth, whereas sea otters are built for that. So I'm going to warn you, I'm going to show you a somewhat graphic photo of a sea otter, a dissected sea otter head, to show you some of the muscles. So if you get queasy, definitely don't look. So as promised, this is a sea otter head that's dissected. And we can really look at those jaw muscles that are found in all mammals, which are the temporalis and masseter muscles. So these muscles are the primary muscles that are used to generate biting ability in all mammals, and that's including us. So the temporalis muscle is this muscle that's kind of near your, like right behind your eye. And in carnivorans, such as sea otters, that's the biggest muscle that's used to generate bite forces. And then the second muscle is the masseter muscle, which is your cheekbone, which is your cheek muscle. And in primates like us, in humans, that muscle is the bigger muscle. So that's why you can feel it along your cheek. And that's bigger than compared to the temporalis. But before I move on, I should say that these sea otters, the reason I have a dissected sea otter head and this skull is that sea otters are protected in California. So whenever there's a stranding, meaning that whenever there's a sea otter that is washed up dead onto shore, people call it in, and the Fish and Wildlife in California, they'll take it into the lab, do a necropsy, which is basically do a dissection of the sea otter to determine why it died. And I made a request for them to basically save the heads for me so I can do these dissections and look at their jaw muscles. So from these muscles, I'm able to, and also some measurements from the skull, I can measure or estimate a bite force, just how much force it can generate with biting. And I found that in sea otters, a maximum bite force is about 500 newtons in adult males, and 550 newtons in adult males, and 500 newtons in adult females. But of course, those numbers don't really mean anything unless there's something to compare them to. So the next thing I did was measure the amount of force it takes to break open their prey items. So they're, clams, mussels, crabs, snails, urchins, and so on. So I use what is known as a materials testing machine to see just, again, how much force it takes to fracture them. So when I compared those fracture forces with these theoretical bite forces, we find that there's a variety of prey items that are well within that bite force limit. So these crabs, urchins, and smaller bivalves. But there's also a variety of prey items that appear too hard for biting alone. And these include like snails, mussels, and clams. So this suggests that these otters are either limited by the types of prey items that they can consume, or they exhibit other types of behaviors that allow them to break into these harder prey items. So some of you, again, may have known that otters are tool users. At least some individuals are tool users. So for example, this otter is a female otter off the coast of California, using a rock as an anvil to break open that Washington clam. So basically it's laying on its back. You have a rock on its belly, and then yeah, it's just crushing that clam against that rock. And I want to point out there might be rumors that individual otters have a favorite rock. I want to say that that's not true at all, because there's no way that otter is going to be carrying a rock that size in its little pocket the entire time. So typically what happens is that when it's crushing its clam like that, once it's open, it's just going to do a little belly roll, drop the rock, and then just eat the clam and then move on. Okay, so we're really interested in examining, how does this tool use lead to increased like foraging success? Does it lead individual otters to gain more food, more calories, and all of that? So the next thing we did, basically, we want to use all this life history data to understand those questions. Just how much food is it getting from tool use? And because, like I said, otters are threatened, they are tracked on a daily basis. So we have very detailed information on their life history. So in this picture here, we have an otter, and you see that their flippers are tagged. So these tags allow us to identify individuals. And because they are tracked every single day, such as this person tracking using a spotter and a GPS tracker, we can see them from shore, and we can get information on, like, what they're eating, the total number of prey items that they're eating, the size of those different prey items, as well as whether it's using tools or not. And obviously we can get like things like location, their sex, and because they're tracked and captured occasionally, we can get information on their age and weight and things like that. So from all of that information, we can then understand, to look at the relationship between tool use frequency and access to novel prey. So here's just a simple graph. So on an x-axis, we have tool use frequency. On a y-axis, we have prey hardness, which is just like how much hard prey each individual otter is consuming. And we find that there's a good relationship between the two, indicating that individual otters that use tools frequently were able to gain access to harder prey compared to individuals that don't use tools. So this suggests that tools are needed to gain access to these novel, harder prey items. And similarly, we also found that there's a great relationship between increased tool use frequency and an increase in caloric income. So this means that tool-using individuals that use tools a lot, they will gain more calories compared to non-tool-using individuals. So this is just, some data showing like tool use is important. And thus far, we really started to investigate, these differences in individuals that do use tools and individuals that don't use tools and just use biting, and how it relates to differences in diets, and whether it leads to differences or whether it leads some individuals to become more of a clam specialist, or others to be more of an urchin specialist, or there's a snail specialist, and so on. And now we're interested in examining, whether all of these differences, do they lead to differences in fitness? So does tool use lead individuals to gain greater body health, as well as increased reproductive success compared to non-tool users? So these are questions that we're currently investigating. So now I'm going to transition into looking at mustelids and other carnivorans as a whole. So sea otters are just one species, but they actually are within a group of carnivorans known as the mustelids. And this group includes the weasels, the martens, the wolverine, skunks, the red panda, raccoons and badgers, and many more. And I should say musteloids, not mustelids. So musteloids is the superfamily that includes the mustelids, procyon, mephidids, and the red panda. So mustelids are great, or carnivorans in general are a great study system, just because they are very diverse, and they're found all across the world, basically, including Antarctica with the seals. So you have things that live in rainforests, tropical and temperate forests, grasslands, deserts, and even the oceans. And they exhibit all sorts of different adaptations that allow them to survive in these different habitats. such as being arboro, cassoro, fossoro, aquatic. And my favorite is that some have even learned how to commandeer woodpeckers and take flight. So one of my main research questions is to understand why there's so many different species and why do they all look so different. So this is a phylogenetic tree of some of the carnivorans, particularly the mustaloids, again, depicting the evolutionary relationships between the two, or between the different species that I created. So like I said, the mustaloids are comprised of mustelids, porcinids, ailurids, and mephidids, so the skunks, red panda, raccoons, and the mustelids, which are the most diverse, which are included the otters, the weasels, like polecats, badgers, martins, and many more. So going back to carnivorans as a whole, they exhibit all sorts of different diets, ranging from hypercarnivorous diets, such as in foxes and tigers, to dirophagous behaviors, such as hyenas that eat bones, to more fruit eating, such as this. Oh, I'm blanking on a name. It's not a kinkajou. It's a lingo. Things that are more omnivorous, such as badgers, and obviously our sea otters that eat all of these marine invertebrate prey. So one of my research aspects is then to actually look at the underlying morphologies that allow them to eat these different types of diets, such as looking at their skulls. So these are 3D scans of these different skulls. And part of my research is examining that skull diversity and how it relates to dietary diversity across this entire group. So just looking at these skulls, you can see there's great differences in the sizes and shapes, which I'm going to switch to this figure. Looking at across these different skulls, there's differences in sizes and shapes. And this allows some species to be more carnivorous, other species to be more plant eating, other species to be more insect eating. So we use a lot of different types of models to quantify these differences between these different species. So a lot of work is done in museum collections. So this is at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, back when I was in grad school. And I took a bunch of undergraduates, or no, these are not even undergraduates. These are high school students during the summer to look at some of the skulls. And we did a lot of photographs and caliper measurements to take some data of these different species. And again, the goal is to try and understand why are they so diverse and how do they relate to differences in diets. So typically nowadays, to quantify these things, I use 3D scanning. So this image is of a 3D scanner scanning this mandible of the lower jaw of the skull. And basically what it does, it sits on this platform that rotates and it shoots light structure or lasers at it to make a 3D reconstruction. Other times I'll do more CT scanning. So have you ever been to a doctor and they take x-rays? It's basically the same idea, except this x-ray takes like an hour or 2 hours and it creates a 3D image, which is something like you'll see here, which is pretty cool because then once you 3D scan it, you have this file on your computer and you can do all sorts of things with it. And all of this seems very fun, but the biggest thing that I typically do is look at data. So this is what I typically work with on a day-to-day when I'm not scanning or out in the field. And it's just Excel sheets of lots and lots of numbers. And I use something called R to analyze that. So lots of computer programming to understand this data that I've collected, run all sorts of different types of stats and models. And that's the primary form of analyses that a lot of biologists do. So if you take classes that do like stats or math and even physics, those are useful. As I have learned the hard way, definitely pay attention in those classes if you're interested in biology, because that is what you will be doing for most of the day if you're a biologist. And I'll just end with one of the biggest things that I also do is work with students, both high school students and undergraduate students. So these are just a few of the undergrads that I've worked with in the past couple of years. And we do lots of different types of projects, ranging from things I just kind of showed you with 3D scanning and those kind of modeling, all the way to field work. So like down below, a lot of had a couple of folks that do a lot of rodent trapping just to tag them so we can understand more of their ecology and distribution. And yeah, it's been fun. So if you're really into biology and this type of work, definitely reach out. And I think I will end there. Yes.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris. That was super interesting. We're going to move on to our question and answer session. We have about 15 minutes. So if any folks want to pop any questions in the chat, then now is a good time to do that. But I will start off with a question. Curious about the jaw structure of other animals that are, you said, were related to otters that maybe are not munching on things quite so hard as shells. So do you notice that the musculature is different in those like the fruit eating animals as well?
Yeah. So with the soft eating fruit or soft fruit eating species, their jaws are way thinner. Their muscles are definitely less robust. Even their teeth, especially their teeth, there's just fewer of them. They're definitely not as robust. So, like, you can pick up a skull and typically guess what it's eating just based on looking at it.
So interesting. All right, we have questions pouring in, which is great. First question is, what is the difference between river otters and sea otters?
Yeah, so there's only one sea otter, and there's about 12 river otters across the world. So in North America, you've probably seen it up in Maine, the North American river otter. It's found all across North America, especially up in the northern part of North America. And there's lots of different species. So, down in South America, like the giant river otter, the South American river otter. In Asia, there's a few like the smooth-coated otter and like the small-clawed otters. In Africa, there's also a couple. So a lot more diversity in river otters compared to just the single sea otter that's found along the coast of North America, ranging from California all the way up to Alaska and into Russia.
It's interesting that only one has adapted to saltwater, but there's so many. I feel like it's
Yeah,
interesting there's
well,
an East Coast sea otter.
so I guess technically there is one more marine otter, which is literally called the marine otter, and that's along the coast of South America, like where Chile is. Um, but it's very unknown in terms of like it's not very well studied compared to sea otters, and they're much smaller too. So there is one more species that lives in the ocean.
So interesting. Are otters a capstone species? And if yes, what makes them a capstone species? And could you explain that concept?
Yeah, so a keystone species is a species that is essential to an environment. So if you take that species away, the ecosystem will collapse. So the sea otters is one of the greatest examples of that, especially up in Alaska. So the idea is that sea otters feed on urchins. That's their favorite food source. And without sea otters, if you take sea otters away, those urchins will basically overpopulate. And what urchins feed on are the kelp. So if you have so many urchins that are eating all the kelp, those kelp forests are gone, and then all the other animals that are around there depend on the kelp for food or just shelter and all that. So those kelp forests will disappear when the urchins eat it all. So that's why sea otters are essential for the survival of kelp, because they eat all the little urchins that are eating the kelp.
It all has to be in a good balance. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Do otters ever injure themselves while eating?
Yes. So one of the things that we've been looking at is the relationship between tool use behavior and tooth fracture. So if you look at some of these otters, especially older otters, their teeth are completely destroyed, which is just like, it just must have been painful. So like I'm talking about molars that are just cracked in half, molars that are just missing. And because if you imagine taking a clam and even if you're using tools, biting down on that clam, they are super hard to break open, and they're just using their teeth to try to get their food. It's going to just destroy their teeth. So lots of injuries for eating, and that's usually one of the leading causes of death in sea otters. It's just once you don't have your teeth, then you basically can't eat anymore.
That makes sense. That would be a really painful experience, I'm sure. We have some questions about how tool use works. So does the otter hold the rock under it, or how does it hit the rock on its belly to open up the food?
Yeah, so it basically puts the rock on its belly and then just basically say like, this is my clam. It basically hits this clam against the rock until it cracks open or it thinks it cracks it open, and then it uses its teeth to pry it open to eat the insides.
That's interesting.
And occasionally they'll also use people's boats to
Really?
as like an anvil. So they'll go to the hull of a boat and basically bang a clam against it to open. Obviously, people don't like that, but they do it.
That's too funny. I mean, it's clever. That's a big hard object that they can use.
Yeah, exactly.
We have some concern about sea urchins and otters and how they eat them with all the spikes.
Yeah, so urchins, the way they handle them is they basically use their little paws and just like remove all the spines and then just crack it open. So if you ever handle an urchin, they're relatively breakable especially compared to a clam. So they don't even really need a tool for that. The spines to them are no problem at all, especially since urchins and abalone, that's their favorite food, and they'll basically just devour all the urchins they can, and spines seem to be no major concern.
That's impressive. I think that would deter me.
You're right.
Or have you ever been bitten by an otter?
Luckily, no. Yeah, so I would definitely not want to be bitten by an otter. And if you ever get a chance of going like kayaking or paddling with the otters, that's one thing you definitely don't want an otter to come on board and you don't want to provoke an otter, because if they can get close to you, they will try to rip your face off.
Oh gosh, I didn't realize they're so fearsome. But now that I know about their jaws, I'm a little more frightened.
Yeah.
How long do otters live for?
So in captivity, I think the oldest is 20 years, but in the wild, typically 10 to 15 years, 10, 15 definitely the max. So sea otters, they definitely have a lot of things going against them. So they are one of the smallest marine mammals. So they don't have blubber. So think of like whales or seals. They're really fat and they got all that fat to keep them warm. Whereas sea otters, they're really dependent on the fur and they're really dependent on eating. So they are constantly eating just to maintain energy. And that life is pretty hard. As I mentioned with the teeth, once their teeth are gone, they can't eat. And also there's all sorts of different, they get cold easily because they're so small.
How is in relation to that? How is climate change affecting their environment? Is it making it easier or harder for them to survive?
Yeah, it definitely makes them harder just because a huge part of it is their prey sources are declining, both due to climate change and also just competition with like fishermen. So with climate change, those prey distributions are decreasing, and with less prey, they either have to move somewhere or they they starve basically.
Would you say that climate change is the main reason they're endangered, or is it any human activity?
So the main reason why they're endangered is because of humans. So if you ever get to feel a sea otter fur, it is the softest thing you can ever feel. Like you just totally want to stick your face in it. And I totally understand why people back in the day hunted them, just because that fur again is super soft. So they were hunted to near extinction uh, decades ago, but have since rebounded with help. But to this day, most sea otters are still threatened by fishermen because fishermen view them as competition for these different types of prey items, and also shark bites up in Northern California. So with the decline in other shark prey, sharks will bite a sea otter, realize it's not good prey because it's not fatty, spit it out. But because sea otters are small, a single bite, basically, they bleed to death. So those are the two primary causes of death in Californian otters.
That is a bummer. A shark bite would be no fun either. That's another jaw I don't want to
Yeah,
experience.
definitely.
We have a question about how many different foods can sea otters eat? I know you mentioned a few at the beginning.
Yeah, so they will eat anything they can get their little hands on. mostly those invertebrate prey. So clams, mussels, crabs, urchins, abalone, snails. Yeah, any kind of seafood. They don't really eat fish though, which is surprising. They go for more of those invertebrate types.
The ones that
Even
are harder to eat.
ours.
That's interesting. We got a thank you from Jonathan. I just want to read this. He said, my students say, quote, you have changed the morphology of our brains. So I think that's great.
Great.
Cascade wants to know how much weight can an otter hold on their belly? Is that a known number?
That's a great question. I have no idea. Yeah, that's something that would be cool to understand. And also one of my questions I've asked or wanted to ask is just like, how does their like, rib cage look after all that banging, which no one really knows. So that's future work.
That's so interesting to think about. Yeah, I'm sure that would hurt your stomach if you're just
Yeah,
banging
exactly.
rocks on it all the time. All right, we have, what is your favorite animal to learn about?
My favorite animal to learn about. Well, like I said from the beginning, love orcas, and I'm just basically slowly making my way up the food chain. So there's lots of more things to learn about orcas. But I mean, even just mustelids in general, a lot of these mustelids are super unknown. So like some of the South American mustelids, like the what is it? The Colombian weasel has only been photographed once ever, and that weasel, that photograph of that weasel was on top of someone's random toilet. It's just super random. So like lots of different species that's totally unknown, and it'd be cool to study them and see what makes them unique.
That's too funny. What a funny only picture of an animal.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Some folks want to know how many otters you have rescued, or I guess maybe how are we preserving otters since they're an endangered species?
Yeah, so I personally haven't rescued otters, but the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California that I work with do. So the best way they rescue them is typically if they find a pup, a stranded pup that its mom either lost a pup or died. They'll take that pup and bring it into the aquarium and then basically have a surrogate mom take care of it and raise it, and then they'll release it back into the wild. So lots of or sort of Monterey Bay Aquarium basically started that program, and I know other aquariums like the aquarium in Chicago does it too. So that's the primary way of keeping the population up.
That's great. All right, we probably have time for a couple more questions. One will be, do sea otters get aggressive with each other?
Yeah, so male otters are territorial for competition for females. So they will fight to the near death, which is crazy to see. So they basically use their jaws and bite each other in in every part of their body.
Ouch. Speaking of, I guess, fighting and biting, do they have any predators?
Not naturally. So sharks only bite them because they think it's a seal, but then they spit them out. Up in Alaska, a few decades ago, with the decline in seals, orcas will eat sea otters, but again, they're not preferred prey just because they're not very fatty. So an orca would have to eat like 10 sea otters a day just to maintain its survival. So those are the only real predators that eat otters, but typically nothing will eat them.
Not super efficient, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay, now final two questions. One is, how long can a sea otter hold its breath?
Oh, that's a good question. I want to say 10 minutes, but I could be totally
Wow,
wrong. Um, it's yeah, it's somewhere around 5 to 10 minutes, I would think.
that's mind-boggling. I can't imagine living like that. And our last question is, what is your favorite part about your job?
My favorite part, it has so many things. It's just like discovering new things with these different species because I get to, since I'm an evolutionary biologist, trying to understand like why these species have evolved and trying to quantify that. And the second part is just working with students just to get their minds thinking about these different things that they might be not be thinking previously, and also get them involved in, science.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. This was so fascinating. It was really exciting to learn about otters. Before I let you all come on and wave goodbye, I just want to do a quick plug for our next Scientist to Go, which is on Tuesday, the 26th, same time, and it's with Dr. Juan Torres Perez, who'll be discussing his work with NASA. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you then. I'm going to stop.